So I'm going to sit. I like conversations, a little bit more intimate. So this panel, I think this panel is pretty much the heart of the symposium. This is why we've come together to just have the emerging artists that may have had some apprehension or doubt about entering into this public art space, to remove their fears. And so you're about to hear from actual artists and their entry and access points into the public art realm. And so we have three panelists that are representing varied years of experience within the public art realm. And so we have Ronald Beverly, photographer and instructor, whose studio is in Bowie. We have Marianne Mears, sculptor, who's practiced in Baltimore City, and Valerie Thabaj, artist and studio in Mount Rainier, the Gateway Arts District. So if we can begin with Ronald Beverly, who is a veteran photographer, but a newbie to the public art space. Let's start with you.
All right. That's the control there. Hello, everyone. I first want to thank Rhonda and the committee to have me invited to participate in this panel. What I'm going to do is start out with the pieces that were selected in the couple of places I was able to participate in. My first entry into the public field began with MGM a few years back, so I would probably be considered the newest person up here because it's pretty much of a fresh entree into displaying my work. And what I wanted to, the way I came about this was I just happened to be sitting at my email computer when a blast email came across saying they were having a call for portfolio review to meet at the Busboys and Poets in Hydesville, and I had just finished printing my portfolio. And so I said, well, it's kind of late in the day on Friday, they're doing it Saturday morning, and almost talked myself out of it because being a photographer, you know, it's not common practice to associate photography in the public field, which I later took on as a task of mine to try to change that perception. And so I went down to the calling and I had my portfolio, very little clue as to what the calling was about, but I was ready, and I've been a photographer for many years, perfecting my craft. And they took a look at the work. I got some good responses. This is a signature piece that probably started it all for me. And what I was able to do with that in terms of working with MGM was, I think Rhonda already showed this piece as it appears in one of the suites. In working with designers and working with clients, you kind of have to have that idea of you're being hired to do a job. In terms of an artist, I'm very attached to my work emotionally, and over the years, you know, I'm very reluctant to have a lot of tweaks done to it, but just in terms of the space and working with the people and understanding what it is that's needed, this is a piece that became a result of that. The idea was, I was fortunate also to have multiple venues within this property. So the idea of MGM, in addition to that signature piece, was they were doing a theme of cherry blossoms, which is what this area is known for. And I was grateful that when they approached me with this particular commission, it was not required to photograph the typical Tidal Basin, Jefferson Memorial, frame the monuments with cherry blossoms. So I had a way of doing it, and they allowed me a lot of freedom, which really helped me kind of solidify what my vision would be interpreted. So this was my approach to what I thought would be interesting in terms of photography. What you're seeing are all generated from photographs that I took. And so when you kind of go through the idea of saying, this is what I want, this is what I'm passionate about, and we worked together, and what wound up being accepted was the images along the back of this bar down in the casino at MGM. So if you're in the MGM casino and you walk from one end to the other, you're going to run into this bar, and along the back of the bar you see my interpretations of cherry blossom designs. It's been my intent for a while to really kind of stand out from the typical photographic perceptions because of the technology and what it's done to the profession. Everybody's a photographer, everybody has a camera, but not everybody's really taken it to another level in terms of meaning, personal expression, and going above and beyond what I fondly refer to as a point and shoot concept. I teach, and I have a love-hate relationship with the technology. I have to really restrain myself to make sure that I'm doing what I need to do, not what I supposed to do when I merged the technology with my darkroom training. So here's another interpretation of cherry blossom arrangements that I would work with. And then the interpretation of it was a series of shots I took here to show you kind of the installation where this wound up on the second floor, what they call the piano bar. And it's about 80, 90 feet long, so there were some challenges in terms of how to upscale my imagery to compete in the space that's, usually dominated by 3D artists and mural painters, and that was one of the challenges I guess we can cover in terms of the Q&A. But this is located there on the second floor. And this is the most current piece that I've designed. Again, it's a cherry blossom kind of approach. It's in the hotel now. This was my design I submitted to be considered for commission work at the hotel. And then the following shows you where it's in place. I started researching in terms of other ways to present my imagery on more durable substrates. I do all of my photographs. I learned in the darkroom and gathered my education and my degrees out of the darkroom. And then when I came out, I was confronted with the new technology that was vastly trickling down the pike, and I just had to kind of make adjustments. So I wanted to stand out in terms of exactly what I do as a photographer and kind of break the mold of traditional interpretations of what photography is supposed to be. So I would consider myself a fine art photographer based on that alone. Another shot of a second piece that's also on the other side. We'll see this this evening, late this afternoon. So that was an opportunity to participate in that. And so what I continue to do at this point is have public art opportunities in mind. I know I have to fill a certain space. It's much larger than the picture hanging on the wall that I'm accustomed to in the typical approaches of trying to get your work seen. So it's somewhat daunting in terms of photography, in terms of how I accomplish these tasks. So what you're seeing now is just my personal work that kind of led me to where I am and the kind of things that I can do perfection-wise. A lot of it's a panoramic type of format, which makes it conducive to fill wall space. And so I've learned to do certain things that really bring it to light. And this is a photograph from Cuba I took last summer with 4 other photographers that we wanted to interpret what we felt was important in Havana. And this is a panoramic shot that I photographed. Some more of the same. So it's the idea of going back to my roots and trying to figure out, make sure my craft is on point. And I was actually questioned by one of my former colleagues and a good friend of mine that I work with as a collaborative group. He says, do you still take, regular photographs? Because I went so far off the radar. He's like, you can still take regular pictures, right? I was like, yeah, I think I can. But, he kind of challenged me. And I was like, okay, maybe I'm too far off the deep end. Let me go back to what I know. This is more along the lines of that first piece. This is the kind of work that I'm interested in doing. All these are, again, generated from photographs that I took. I take advantage of the software where it's appropriate. I'm an advocate of the new technology when I need it, and when I don't need it, I don't use it. I don't try to be lazy with what I do as a photographer. I solve all the problems I can in the camera. All the technology is available to me, and when I come up short after I've exhausted all those scenarios, I'll employ, manipulation and software and be proud of it because I think of it in advance. It's not an afterthought. So these are one of these pieces that came from that. Again, now this one's more closely to that first piece. This is like a series. I call it an avatar series. And I photographed landscapes for years. That's where I pretty much got my training in terms of understanding how to get the detail and how to make the photographs sing. I'm very fond of seasons, and so these are reconstruction of pieces of images that I've taken. And with the help of the software, I reconstruct them by hand. And other shapes come with that. And this is another variation of that. I've learned since I've done these that I can actually upscale them and really offer them as a viable option for commission work. So I kind of mastered, what that's about. Another way of being creative, if you see my byline on here in terms of my studio, is creative and conceptual imagery. So I'm always pushed to try to be different and try to attract eyeballs who are looking for something different and trying to engage in photography to deal in this space. Just other examples here. These are dancers with lights. It's all typical routine with photography when you learn about motion and dragging the shutter. I just applied it to a different aspect, collaboration with dancers and their movements and how I orchestrate, how I capture those. This is another extension of that. I'm also experimenting with using figures and face, and not revealing identity necessarily. I'm just kind of taking it another step further. Other designs, again, all photography based. I use the software where I have to get what I want. And just gonna kind of blow through this a little faster because I got my cue.
No, very exciting work.
To speed it up, but again, it's just a matter of showing, my roots for the amount of years I've been photographing, and then taking an interest in entering another market outside of work being collected or being exhibited on the wall. So let me just get to the end. It's going to take me 30 seconds to get through this. Okay.
Fabulous.
Thank you, Ronald. That's some impression being new to the realm of public art. So next we have Marianne, if you would give your presentation.
Okay, to give you something to look at while I'm sort of giving a little bit of history, this is a very recent piece. This is in Columbia, Maryland, and it's really 14 sculptures in a little park area, and the pieces in the foreground actually spin in the wind. So, but I want to go back to how did I get started, what brought me to this point, and I was in college and then graduate school in the late 60s, and at that time, contemporary art programs were getting launched, and when I say there were public art programs, of course, historically, but in the 60s was when Philadelphia and Baltimore started their public art, Percent for Art programs. I was at NYU, and there was a tremendous amount of new thinking coming along, and so including large-scale site-specific art. In fact, that was one of the reasons I went to NYU, and lots of isms, and so it was a really amazing time in terms of the arts community. But in many ways, more important was we were also marching for civil rights and against the war in Vietnam. And so these two things kind of came together for me. I loved the idea of placing sculpture in a specific site and thinking about the interaction of the forms, sculptural forms, and the space. And so that's always been exciting to me. And but on the other hand, there was also the part about people and politics, and so that I felt that public art was really so important in a democracy, and that art in the context of people's daily lives is rather than in elite kinds of settings. So part of that was, all of that sort of came together for me. And serendipitously, I was hired to teach at CCB, now called BCCC, the community college in Baltimore. And so that brought me to Baltimore, and it turned out to be a great thing. As a welder, Baltimore's industrial, blue collar, lots of resources for anybody working in metal. And the public art program the Percent for Art program had just gotten started. So this is my first public art piece at a recreation center. And as Sandy was talking about, this was for me an entry piece where I really got to learn my craft and learn how to work with. In the case in Baltimore, in that program in the early years, architects were the ones that initiated the selection of the artist. And so I had and part of this was being a woman artist, I did a lot of big pieces and exhibited them so that I was sort of proving that I could do it. And so I got noticed by a couple of architects, and that's how I got to do this piece. This piece, by the way, was destroyed, vanished, and it's part of about $2 million worth of public art in Baltimore City, mostly at schools, outdoor sculpture that has disappeared. And so that's a whole other story, but the preservation of the work is incredibly important when you get to my age. It's a huge consideration, and I think there's going to be a panel on it, or probably a couple, at the Art Summit in June, which I hope people will come to. And again, I'm really interested in what Alec was talking about, another session on this. It's really a huge issue. So this is another example. This is my second public art piece, and this was at a school in Baltimore. And this is what's interesting when you get to my age. Pieces outlive their settings, their sites. And so this piece, fortunately, because I was paying attention when the school closed, I made arrangements to remove the piece, and then happily I was enabled to reinstall it at one of the new 21st century schools in Baltimore. And actually, the side of the photograph is Chris Jurek, who's a conservator. The piece is Core 10, so we did have to do restoration work on it. And so, again, the artist and the conservator as a team is really, really important, because I had the memory, having built the piece myself, I had a lot of information about how it was put together, and she understood the metallurgy around the issues around Core 10. So moving right along, this is a piece that I did early in my career, and it was an invitational competition, well-established artists. I was the youngest one, and it was a prominent site in Baltimore City Inner Harbor, and just repainted, by the way. I thought the world was going to be a pathway to my door. That did not happen. It's interesting, and I think that another thing about that piece, I used a fabricator for the first time in that for that sculpture, because I was building the Core 10 piece at the same time. But then it made me realize working with fabricators is a really good way to go, because then you can accomplish more work. I'm going to show you just a couple of the pieces that are around here. This is in Bethesda at Metro Center, and this was a result of the optional method of development in Montgomery County, which is terrific, a terrific program. And this is another one. This is Silver Spring, and that was also through the optional method of development program. And that happens because Montgomery County are able to put some strings on projects for developers and require that they provide public amenities, including public art. So that's a great way to get working. One of the things, too, that, and this piece, let me just pause here for a moment. This is a piece that's in Prince George's County at the Cheverly Health Center, and I did that piece along with the public art administrator here was Lauren Dugas Glover at that time. She was terrific, and I have to say, a big shout out to the people who are the project managers, public art administrators, and just to give you just one little vignette of what she did to help me was the fire marshal came in and wanted to close off the balcony, and actually the piece winds up over that balcony, and she said, no, you have to come up with another way to, deal with your fire door.
Wow.
So
that wouldn't fly now.
So, sometimes you just say, wait a minute, does this have to be an obstacle? This is a piece I did in the DC Metro, and this is at the Southern Avenue station, so it's right at the edge of Prince George's and the district. And one of the things that I did, and I've done with a lot of my projects, is that I worked with children from a school, and so I was able to go and do hands-on projects with them, and then they came to the opening, which was wonderful. So I really feel community engagement is incredibly important. This was a great project. The only problem was the installation had to be done between 12 o'clock at midnight and 4:30 in the morning, and you had to get everything out. You couldn't leave anything there, any staging, nothing. So that was interesting. This is Cara Spiral. That's at the Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital up in Boston. And this project and the next one I'm going to show you were, through consultants or, other kinds of contacts, not a public art program per se. So those are avenues, and I guess it's just sort of, being out there. And then, this is Spun Grace. That's St. Agnes Hospital in Baltimore. And then this is Reston, Virginia, and that was a public art, the public art program in Reston is a relatively new program, but they're doing lots of work, and again, a wonderful arts administrator to work with. So I encourage you to seek that out online. And this is again back to that piece, and I really part of the story is the collaboration, and in this case, very close collaboration with the, I'm just going to see here, this shows it, with the landscape architect, and we created this berm as just to be interactive, and so I said, well, I wanted to be really, really safe, but we wanted things kids could slide down, and I said ladders and up to slides are really dangerous, and so we decided to make the earth slope so that there were no ladders, and it was much more beautiful. And I guess I think that's my last slide. So a couple of things. In terms of marketing, it's really important, obviously, to have a website. And actually what propelled me to do that quite a ways back was that people were telling me things they'd seen about me online, and I didn't like it. And so I Googled myself, and I decided I've got to get my own story out there. But it also has been increasingly a way to have people, reach out to you. So that's really important. The registries, I'm going to sign up for everyone because I'm not on any of them, but I should be. There's also Cafe Call for Entry, which is a resource, and something called Codex that I'm on. So I'm not a model for marketing. I'm very comfortable being an advocate for the arts, and a lot of people in the room know me as somebody out there fighting for arts in schools, and I can be very passionate and outspoken about that, as Melanie knows, down in Annapolis. But part of the story and why I do that is to make sure that people have access to my work and to all public art, and I'm wrapping it up right on time. And so I really feel that the more we can educate young people, because if they're manipulating materials, if they're having the opportunity to develop creative ideas, if they're learning about art across time and cultures, then they have so many more access points when they're walking down the street, and someone like me is imposing my vision on them for that morning or that afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to have a deep dive into that marketing piece. Lisa, who's here from the Maryland State Arts Council, that's going to be the focus of her presentation tomorrow, so please come back. Valerie, can you talk about your journey into the realm of public art?
Sure. Hi, I'm Valerie Teberge. I've been doing public art for a little over 20 years. I went to art school and studied painting and drawing, and then I moved to Asia for about 10 years. And one thing I want to emphasize is I apprenticed with somebody for 3 years, and I think that was really critical. So I was living in Hong Kong, and I found people doing what I do right now is I work in glass. I work in predominantly mosaics, and I make sculptures and 2 and 3D work. And I paid my dues. I worked really hard for somebody who was doing the work, learned, everything I could in 3 years, and then I branched out on my own. And then once I branched out on my own, it took me a while because it's a real static medium. It took me a real long time to try to find my voice in there. So my evolution was long and windy, but I would say one thing I wanted to say when I learned the topic that I was talking about today is, and I've talked to many public art managers about this, but I'd like to see mentorship programs, if possible, paid mentorship programs. I'll get to my work in a second, but one of the people that has been working for me for 5 years, she's now at Towson State. She started through Joe's Movement Emporium as an intern, and Joe's paid her to work for me, and she's now on her, she can now work on her own. So I think if we want to see people, especially a wider array of people getting into the public art realm, I think we need to invest in some sort of mentorship or apprenticeship program. So that's my, so I'll just say I've been, as I said, 21 years. This is a piece I did in Vail, Colorado, at a skateboard park. It's 20 feet tall. It's, I did several pieces for them, and it took about 9 months to do all the work. My work is incredibly labor intensive. I studied I studied a lot of skateboarding, especially female skateboarders, and watched a lot of videos, went to a lot of skate parks. And my work, as you'll see through the pieces that I have, I'm trying to evoke a sense of expansion and a sense of joy. That's really my main purpose, is I want people to feel a sense of elation and movement. So I don't do literal work. I did it when I started, until I sort of found out where what I wanted to say belonged. This is the full piece. It's another one of the ones at the skate park. Oops. This is one in Reston. Reston does have a very good program. I did workshops with children, and they did little pieces that I put in the tunnel. You can't really see them, but and this is sort of close up. But again, I study a lot of molecular structures, and and I'm not really good at articulating this, but I study a lot of molecular structures and cellular structures, and I'm I blow them up larger than life size. If anybody has ever seen Charles and Ray Eames' movie, The Power of 10, where they go down by the power of 10, the fact that, we're sitting here and we both have these universes of cells within us has just really fascinated me for decades. So this is the one that Sandy Bellamy had talked about for Baloo. It's 80 feet long, so it's quite large. For this one, I had a couple of interns from Baloo. They came to my studio, and it wasn't the most, they came to my studio. It was a long way for kids coming. I'm in Mount Rainier, Maryland, without a metro stop. So it's a long way for kids, high school kids, to come without a car. So again, a mentorship program has to take into account, that people's capacity to get there, to show up, to have the time, and to have funds so that they can get paid while they're learning, because it is work. This is a piece I did in Yolo, California. It's outside of a youth detention center. And generally, I go visit the site, and I talk to the landscape. I talk to the, there's so much information that you're intuiting in a space. So I do my research, I meet the people, but I don't take direction. That's really important part of my work, is I don't take direction, but I've been doing this so long that I take all the information needed, and through sort of a meditative process, where I want to go comes to me. It's not without considering, obviously, the site. There's some phoenixes, 3 phoenixes rising, because I really strongly believe in the power of people's ability to change. So this detention center is where the families will come and meet with their children. And there's a lot of federal children that are, have federal offenses, so their parents could live in Arizona and they have to come all the way up to California, Northern California. So I wanted to give a sense of hope and lightness and joy to people who are going through difficult times. That's just sort of one of me up there, so you can see the scale. This is in Arizona at a community center, and it's about 45 feet long. That was a real difficult one to install. But again, my theme of cellular structures, this sense of fluidity in life, there's sort of a detail of it. This is for park and planning. I've been really appreciative of a chance to really explore and experiment with jobs that I've gotten through several local organizations such as Maryland Park and Planning. I worked with seniors on this one, and these are all pieces that are attached onto the wall. So the wall, I started with the wall, which was this sort of rusty. Our images down here are much better than the ones you see here in terms of saturation. So there's hundreds of circles, and I worked with seniors at this center, and they did some of the circular structures, probably about out of the 200 circles, they probably did about 10, but they got a chance to practice and get their hands in it, and then I incorporated, I sort of wove it into the project. I did something with Rhonda similar to that with children at a high school in Prince George's. And this is one for the Smith Center for the Healing Arts on U Street. And this was inspired, it's a center for people who are experiencing cancer or other traumatic experiences. And so I was trying to get something that was soothing and light-filled. A lot of reflective qualities in it. And there's sort of a detail of the pieces. And now I'm mostly working in sculptures. This is at a private residence. But just through sort of dreamlike states, I keep getting images that I feel really lucky to be able to actualize. That's outside of a building in, a developer bought it in Prince George's on Rhode Island Avenue. Mm-hmm. This was another one for Park and Planning that I did. And again, it was a great chance to experiment because I was working for a woman who manages programs, and she gave me, complete freedom. So let's see, there's another sculpture that was part of a sculpture biennial in Foggy Bottom. And then that's just a detail. So that's some of my work, but I really want to just go back to the fact that I think I would like to see more mentorship programs, and I'd like to see more people come up in this realm. And I've had a great chance to have people work for me that have kind of gone on and branched out. But I think it's important that there's opportunities for people, and it takes years to sort of master just the craft of it, and then you need to sort of marry that with who you are as an artist. And I also want to say I have great fabricators, including Howard Connolly, who has done tremendous work for me. He carves all my sculptures, and I give him really terrible designs, and he makes them into 3D. So I have a lot of wonderful people that I refer to help me with expanding my work. So thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, because as I said, this panel is kind of the heart of the symposium, there are a couple of questions that I want to further dialogue amongst ourselves as insight, as particularly for those who are emerging artists in this field. So, first question, as artists and also as curators like myself, we know when we've entered that place of personal fulfillment, that sweet spot in your public art journey. Can you share any moment or periods of evolution or transition within your practice that helped you advance your current work today?
Okay. For me, it was more or less of trying to get photography respected to the level where it can compete in these public spaces. Mm-hmm. I spent a lot of time perfecting my craft. I've been a photographer for 30 years. I have a master's degree from GW and a bachelor's from Howard University. And so I spent a lot of my time trying to get photography to a point where people can like what I have for what I have to show and not get caught up in what they think I should have for them to exhibit or collect. And so I was sticking to my creative vibe when I began to get responses when I started stepping out of the box. And some of the images that I showed you in my presentation, people really started to like what I was doing. It was very different. And I was able to get some purchases, and obviously I had a chance to, be commissioned to do some work. But I think for me, the actual transition was to take my craft to a different level and take photography to an area where people aren't accustomed to looking at it, not accustomed to asking me 2 or 3 times, is this really photography? And I was like, it is. It's my interpretation of what I've been doing for 30 years. So I think when they started appreciating a few of my signature breakout pieces, for lack of a better term, was critical for me.
Wonderful. Anybody else want to comment?
Well, this is, I want to say that, and it was interesting to hear when Ronald said he didn't want to go to that, the doubt. And that's, to me, it's not necessarily the exterior tangible, it's what's in our minds. It's the doubt we have about who we are. Mm-hmm. And that's the piece in my mind that needs to be contended with the most. And every level we take in these things, I think we're coming up against our own insecurities. And so for me, strengthen my inner knowing about who I am and where I'm going is sort of the first step for me to see that change in the outside world. Of course, it's really helped to have people support you and believe in you, but I feel like that is greatly reflected by our ability to overcome our own fears and doubts. And there's been so many times where I haven't wanted to apply or I haven't wanted to ask, and I have to kind of contend with remember who I am and what I'm going. And I'm going for wanting to bring a sense of lightness and joy in this world, which I feel like is every day we could use a dose of. So I'm just keeping on that focus, and when the doubt comes up, I need to, work on that piece before I can keep moving forward, because our entire careers, whatever we're doing, it's just this constant step forward, step forward, step forward. So, it's not exactly a direct answer, but that's my deep personal belief.
And actually, I would say the same for myself. And one of the things about doing public art is that you make all kinds of judgments, and you do a model, and you may do things using Photoshop to project how the piece would look in the site and that sort of thing. But there is that moment of truth when it's installed and you step back and you look at it for the first time. And sometimes it's years from when you first imagine what you're doing, and then there it is. And I would say there's maybe a few seconds where you say, oh, wow, it works. And then you go to, at least I do, I go to, oh my God, will I ever be able to do anything this well again? What's the next one going to be? And yeah, and all the questioning and doubt is there, and it's always there. And then you have to sort of just go ahead and go for it. And I have the same issue. Is there a good excuse, a good reason why I'm not going to respond to that RFP or RFQ or whatever? Yeah. And so, and again, having other artists, but your family, my daughters, wonderful, at sort of building me up and saying, come on, Mom, you can do it.
Thank you. One of the comments that you made, Valerie, which resonates, with me strongly, is that mentorship, apprenticeship. And it's something that we're talking seriously about at the Arts and Humanities Council. I saw, Tara, you shaking your head. So I think we all recognize that there's a greater need, particularly if it is our mission to get more artists involved in this public art space. So I have a question that kind of expands it even further. So Marianne, you and I both work on the Fine Arts Advisory Committee for the Maryland State Department of Education. Ronald, you're an instructor, professor at Montgomery College. Valerie, I know the work that you do with students at all levels. So my question is, how can current fine arts curriculum at both the college and high school level better prepare art students and offer professional development opportunities for career artists interested in this public art career path?
Well, one thing I just want to say first is I think that people don't even think it's a possibility that you can have a job in this realm. And I think as artists, we buy into it as much as we reflect that back. So I think there needs to be a fundamental shift on the possibilities. I also think that, who knows who they are? I mean, maybe there's a few in the high school years. So just the fact that that's a possibility and that's an opening, it might take people 10 years to get around to it. And, I've had people say, oh, can these children, even if they're 16, 17, 18, they're still youth, participate in the design aspect. And I think there's a time and a place, I really want to emphasize, I think you need to pay your dues before you're ready to go out there and spearhead a public art project. So I think, one thing, I like to have tours of kids come to my studio because I want them to know that, yes, this is a pathway too. It's not just accounting or things that are kind of easily set out there. But then, there needs to be a lot of development that happens before you can actually enter that realm. So the expectation that, children can spearhead a public art project, I think, is really misguided. Yeah. But I would like to see the mentorship program happening when they're in the adult stage, at a higher level, once they have a little life experience under their belts.
I think that one of the opportunities that gets missed is where there are public art projects at schools. And so one of the things I've talked in the arts education world about is taking advantage of those and making connections to, for the art teacher in the building to actually use the public art piece that's right there as a resource. And I agree with you. I think I've always wanted to engage when I work with elementary kids or middle school kids or whatever, to engage them in how I think in my process, but also within their limitations. In Reston, actually, I'm thinking Ann Delaney, who runs the public art program there, one of the projects they do every year, they have a sculptor who teaches at one of the high schools, and so they do a public art, that high school class does a public art project every year. So to me, it ties into that other larger issue of advocacy, and so instead of public art being sort of an aside, bring it into the mainstream of arts curricula.
I think for me, being an instructor and teaching photography at Montgomery College or just anywhere, the students nowadays are interested in what alternatives there are beyond the usual, what am I training myself to do and how am I going to make money and how am I going to pay my mortgage or my rent. So what we try to do fundamentally, and I'm in a unique position to kind of modify how the curriculum is going to be shaped because being the program coordinator, I had tasked with move the program forward. And so what we do fundamentally is that we instill in the students to understand how important the narrative is. Not strictly as a photojournalism, not trying to turn them into documentary photographers, but what sets the students apart now is taking time to give some thought as to why are they making these images. And what we put into our program is to begin that thinking process. And so I think that's important when you encourage them to move into an area like public art. You have to have a narrative or some type of story that conforms to the space that you're considering. And when they look at my work and they wonder what I'm doing, obviously, me being newest into this public art venture, they have a lot of questions. It ranges from how do you do that, and do you print your own pictures, and who does this and who does that. And it's kind of interesting because I'm still, processing my exposure, and they're sitting there saying, "You got this work done, so share it with me." So it's kind of like a sponge for them. But the bottom line is thinking more about the kind of imagery they make. And the narrative and the storytelling aspect is much more important than it used to be.
And I have we have time for one last question. One last question. Okay, and I look at this is real talk. So there is much dialogue within the arts world today around inclusivity, diversity, and equity within museum boards, review panels, curatorial staff, cultural representation, artist commissions, etc. So based on your individual journeys, how do you navigate these real or perceived barriers? If anyone.
Well, I think I alluded a little bit to back in the 60s when I was getting started, there were not a lot of role models who were women who were, did public art. And so I did have to overcome what's a nice little girl like you doing here, or you can't lift 200 pounds, how can you really be a sculptor, sort of thing. And that has changed happily. But that was a barrier for me in the early years.
I think for me, it's some of more of the being an artist of color and trying to find out what is being represented in collections, what's being represented in exhibitions, what's being represented in advertising. Curators and museum directors have a tendency to want something they're comfortable with, want something that they're accustomed to in terms of the kind of art that they wish to see and wish to get behind. And I refused, over a period of time, this wasn't any like one, conversation I had with anybody, but as I saw things at conferences and art collecting venues, I would show my work and they would be looking for one aspect and I would probably show them the other aspect. And I was very, very certain and very sure that I would not bend to what they're accustomed to and what they're comfortable with. And I would just continue to push the type of artwork that I would do as a photographer. And it's just a matter of time before they like what you have, not what they expect you to bring to them. So it's a barrier that goes on. And I'm relentless in terms of trying to put my vision forth. And if it's a timing thing where it all comes around where they're all of a sudden interested in the stuff I showed them 15 years ago, all of a sudden now it looks nice, or they're interested in it, it's just being ready and being persistent. So walking up to the barriers, climbing up over the barriers, peeking over top is kind of how I navigate that issue.
And I would just say the tenacity. I mean, I think there's something that you said, just the persistence that is needed to kind of make it in this realm. And I really appreciate what Alec and Rhonda are doing. I've been working in Prince George's for 15 years, and it's been a really wonderful watching the evolution. And I think this can be the start of that. And just again, seeing people who are farther down the road than you, and that's why I'd like to really emphasize if we could get a mentorship program here so that the younger people in Prince George's can come up and make their way.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to open the floor for any questions. If anyone wants to address the panel, please step forward to the mic. And if not, I think this has been a very engaging conversation. We covered a lot of issues and topics, and we thank each of the panelists. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you, Alec. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
So, what I like about having Ronald on the panel is that he moved two-dimensional art into something that could be translated into public art. You want to talk about that process and what you went through to do that and how you used others to help you to do that?
Tell all my secrets.
But just pique their interest about that.
Well, in terms of moving what is conceived of a photograph hanging on the wall to moving into a public art space takes a lot of, not being afraid of not knowing what I don't know. I look at work that's out there. You do the research and try to figure out what it is you have and you don't have. My creative ability is pretty sound, and I'm confident about what I can do as a photographer. But to put it in this space, you have to have teamwork. You have to do your research. You have to find out what fabricators are out there. For some time, it was an issue for me of saying, well, how am I going to do this? Because I'm so accustomed to doing what I've been doing for 30 years. But it's like, well, have you heard of fabricators? Have you heard of working with designs? When you get these fundings to put together a design to sell your idea, think about that. Oh, okay, now it's teamwork. And so I don't know everything there is to know, but it was a struggle for me to move the pendulum to the point where I know what I can do and I know what I can't do. A lot of what solved my problem was better equipment in terms of upscaling my work, whereas the other artists can work to scale, I have to upscale. And so the integrity of the image has to hold together. So a lot of what I was missing was making this hard investment in medium format cameras or high megapixel cameras that you all hear about all the time. And at some point, it means nothing if you're just living your image on the computer screen or you're just making a small print or uploading to a social network. The megapixels make a difference if you're trying to print. If you're trying to print large, even if you're prepping the image for another fabricator who is going to do the actual upscaling. You have to provide a decent file, and a lot of that has to do with the equipment. And so I had to sit back and say, okay, I have to make this investment. I'll let go what I have to let go of, but I will not let go until I've reached that point. So equipment, although you hear it a lot and people give you all these pricings and, does it really make a difference? For photography, it does in terms of upscaling and maintaining the quality. So.
And then, Ronald, how did you decide whether you were going to translate your two-dimensional photograph into glass or mosaic or any other kind of, how did you decide that? How did you interface with somebody to do that?
As I progressed in my imagery, the type of typical photographs, portraits and landscapes and things like that, I gathered my techniques on that. I think as a landscape photographer for many years, I become very acquainted with the textures and the seasons, and I thought it would be interesting to use Photoshop proudly to really depend on how I want to break it down. It was just a natural evolution, because I could take a landscape picture and look, superb in terms of seasons, nice landscape. Everybody's getting on board with that, and then I felt that I could challenge it, and so I think it started with doing a canvas. I was printing on canvas. I do all my own printing. I was printing on canvas, and I was trying to fill the frame on the side, and there's two techniques so you don't get the raw side of the frame, and you want the image to carry over to the back of the frame. So as I did that, I saw what happened to the side of the image. I actually looked at it, and I had to flip it to get it to cover the whole frame. And I was like, huh. And I'm always thinking. I'm never complacent. I'm always thinking about it. Any idea that comes across, I'll do it. So I started doing the mosaic breakdowns of my imagery. That's where the landscape evolution went to from there.
Are there any more? There's another question.
What made you break from your traditional stronghold of photography, traditional education of
I didn't really break from it. I think it's more accurate to say it evolved. Because people will look at me, look at the work and say, so what kind of photographer are you? And I say, I'm a fine art photographer, always have been. And when the tools become available to me, I think I'm sophisticated enough to really apply it to my train of thought that I've been through my 30 years of photographing. And it was just an evolution to get to where I am, whereas other people who haven't experienced the darkroom or haven't experienced the discipline in producing a tangible product that makes it relevant to the other genres, it's like it's a process. It doesn't go anywhere. You still have to understand how to work the camera. You still have to have discipline in producing and creating the process. So it was never a break from it. It was just an evolution.
Are there any more questions? This has been such a wonderful panel. Can we give everyone here a great big round of applause?